We got well behind. Right. Oh gosh. Oh, okay. This feels extraordinary. I should probably introduce myself. My name's Sebastian Morello. I'm a philosopher and a writer, columnist, senior editor, editorial board member for the European Conservative. Look at this. For quite some time now, my books and my articles, I've been writing about what I think is a crisis of Western civilization and a rapid unraveling of our civilization. This person wants me to go back. An amnesia, a widespread amnesia about our cultural sources, about what it is to belong to the great wisdom tradition of Greece, the legal tradition of Rome, the low cultural folk tradition of the nations of Europe, the national traditions, and also how all of that has been assumed into and transformed by the message of the gospel. But I'm just one of a number of people who are highlighting very similar themes, and certainly one of the most innovative and erudite among such thinkers is the psychologist, neuroscientist and philosopher Iain McGilchrist, who lives up here on the Isle of Skye. And I'm a great admirer of his work. In the first year of my doctoral studies, my supervisor suggested to me, as I became more and more concerned about the phenomenon of rationalism and the rise of enlightenment in the 18th century, which I believe to be that from which many of our modern maladies stem. My supervisor suggested to me that I read Iain McGilchrist's work, and I bought a copy of The Master and the Emissary. It's so incredibly readable that I made my way through it quite quickly. There are only a few books I think one should call life-changing, and that really was a life-changing book. The scales sort of dropped from my eyes, and since then I've studied his 2-volume work, The Matter with Things, and I'm very keen to bring his work to the European Conservative readership. Oh. I'll go ring the bell again. Finally got to see a red deer. I can't send him an email or anything because I don't have any reception. Hello? Interesting. Hello? Hello? Sebastian Morello. Yes, and you, may I come in? Yeah. Good to meet you.
Find us okay.
I was supposed to be here an hour ago, but we got completely lost on the island, so sorry to keep you waiting.
Hello. Good.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Not at all. Come in.
What a peaceful place. My goodness.
Yes. You didn't go down the wrong road and meet a locked gate or anything like that?
No, we went down this lovely little hidden woodland on the way down your driveway.
This is the drive.
Yes, fantastic. It felt magical, actually, going down there.
Do you want to walk around straight away, or do you want to sit and have some coffee and then move around, or what? I think coffee is a very, very important part of life.
Do you think that for those who are, how shall I put this, developing a critical view or a negative view of the late stages of our civilization, that this is really the only option to sort of withdraw from the hubbub of it all, and because perhaps otherwise invariably you end up belonging to it, and it you to use that word, it colonizes your own way of thinking.
Yes, I mean it's not that I worked out that this is a plan and that it's even a recommendable response. It's really the only response I can make, in that I have never liked city life at all.
Yeah.
And one of the most extraordinary things is to be up here for a while and then take the sleeper down to London, and you get out at Euston and you realise immediately you're in a completely mad place with everybody rushing around with strained looking faces looking at you. Yes. The air is filthy, the sounds of sirens, it's dangerous, it's expensive, it's noisy, and
can't be at peace.
It's very difficult, and I know that other people, I have friends who live in London and say it's marvellous, but I don't think it's as marvellous as it used to be, partly because everything is so difficult to do spontaneously. I mean, the loss of spontaneity from our lives is a really big thing I've been thinking about a lot, particularly sort of the lives of young people. And I remember what it was like in the 70s when you could sort of go, come on, let's go and do this, but nowadays, have you booked ahead online and have you got a slot? Yeah. And it's like,
have you downloaded the app?
Have you downloaded the app? You can't just go, come on, let's go into the National Gallery and have a look at the Fra Angelicas. You have to have queued up somehow on the internet. It just is ruinously, and it also takes so much time. Anyway, come and have a look around a bit. Italians particularly, and Eastern Europeans, are very good at cities, I think. But I think that one's got to remember is that when people, like Johnson said, a man who is tired of London is tired of life, London was a good deal smaller than Oxford is now.
Yes.
And you can see what is meant, because it's really rather like a sort of very large village.
Yes.
And that's not what we now have.
As you become sensitive to the importance of music in one's life, that when you become attuned to that,
yes,
mindless noise becomes almost intolerable. It becomes a kind of ongoing torture, I think.
Well, I think you're right. Yes, it is. And I think that the sheer necessity to stop doing while listening is something people have forgotten about. That music, if it's at all worthy of the name, requires one's attention. Yeah. It's not something one puts on in the background while doing the washing up or something. And I feel that this is, people want me to do an audio book of the matter of things, and quite apart from the fact it would probably take several months of my life, I'm not sure it's suited to be an audio book.
Yeah.
I started reading it and I found things like, if you look at figure 15,
yes.
So what do I do about this in an audio book?
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of that, because a lot of illustrations.
Yes, I know, yeah.
And I my imagination's quite visual. And so there's that. And then there's just the fact that a lot of people say that they have to take things a paragraph at a time and sometimes chew over the sentences.
Exactly.
So I don't think you can really just have it on like that. This is a phenomenal place to have a sunset, because that rock, not infrequently, glows a sort of orange fire at sunset, and so that's rather lovely. the moment it's the cuckoo. There's a sort of nanosecond between that first moment you hear a cuckoo. You think, oh, wow, a cuckoo. And then you sort of... The moment when you've had enough now.
How long is this going to go on for?
You've delighted us long enough. You know?
Well, we heard peacocks on the way here.
Yes, they're not mine.
Yeah.
And they sometimes come down here and I chase them away.
Do you? Were you influenced much by Vico, by Giambattista Vico?
Well, I was in a way, yes. I read Vico quite a long time back, and his philosophy is important to me, but I wouldn't call myself I'm hardly an expert on Vico.
I read The New Science before I encountered your work, and his view of this concept of the second barbarism and how he thinks civilizations unravel seems to have at least certain analogues with what you've been saying.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, there are a number of people, aren't there, who have pointed to these inevitable progressions and cycles. And
Spengler.
Yes, yeah. I try to resist comparisons with Spengler, but there's something in it.
Yeah.
The person I'm really keen on is Patrick Offals.
Right.
Do you know his Immoderate Greatness?
I know the name.
Yes. It has many things to recommend it, one of it being its shortness.
Right.
And its conciseness.
So you say often when you're asked to give a whistle-stop tour of how you started to write the things you write.
Yes.
Which I it must be terrible having to do that every time you you give a talk. But it seems to me that you began by asking yourself what were essentially questions that were so obvious that everyone neglected them, like why is the brain split down the middle?
Yes.
And why is the brain asymmetrical?
Yes.
And no one seemed to ask themselves these questions.
They sort of hoped they would go away if nobody paid any attention to them. And they didn't go away for me, and I thought there's something here that's worthy of investigation rather than dismissal. In the early days I had to get over the sort of, I told my boyfriend and he's doing biology. He said, all that stuff about hemispheres, I was blown out of the water.
Oh no, right, okay.
So we have to get beyond McGilchrist 101, really, which is, yes, a lot of that, almost all of it was wrong, but that doesn't mean to say that the questions didn't have interesting answers, just that we'd found the wrong ones. And so that's really what happened.
But you can't have ever envisaged that seeking a coherent answer to some of these questions would lead to an entire analysis of the generation and decline of civilizations and a whole historical account.
No, I didn't.
No,
I didn't at all. But I thought it would give me some insights into how the human mind works, how some aspects of human experience that people have noticed, anciently noticed for a couple of thousand years, but have had no explanation for, how these could be reflected in brain structure. And it was the moment when I came across the work of Louis Sass that I realised, it was a real light bulb moment is too feeble an expression. It was a sudden unveiling of something very important. I was in America doing neuroimaging of the brain at Johns Hopkins, and interestingly what I was looking at was asymmetry in the brains of people with schizophrenia who have either reverse symmetry or no asymmetry. So the normal brain is asymmetrical in a way that we can sketch. It's broader at the back on the left and it's broader at the right on the front.
Yeah.
But in schizophrenia, these elements of asymmetry are sometimes reversed or sometimes absent.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that I happened to be looking at. And while I was thinking about people with schizophrenia and so on, John Cutting, who was a colleague of mine who had got into my work and really sort of put me on the path that I'm on now, because he'd already looked at differences between the brain hemispheres when other people had been poo-pooing that and sort of ignoring it. And he said, you've just got to read this book by Louis Sass called Madness and Modernism, and I did. And the thing was that at that very moment, through being in America, I was thinking, there's something I can see that's happening here in America that's not yet got quite this bad in Britain. But, whatever it is that comes from America ends up in Britain sooner or later. And one of them was the complete loss of the sense of the implicit and of irony and humour and things like that.
Right.
I mean, I ended up, in the lab talking to people, and for the first few weeks, almost all the time, I was met with a puzzled stare, and then people saying, really? And then I'd say, no, not really, but never mind. And I realised this was happening everywhere, as well as the way in which public pronouncements and public advertisements and notices treated us as children. They had little cartoons which infantilized whatever it was they were talking about. And I saw all this happening, and I saw the fragmentation of the way in which we think around us, it was just like so obvious from what Sass was describing, which was the coming together of schizophrenia with modernism, that this wasn't about schizophrenia but was about hemispheric imbalance, because schizophrenia involves hemispheric imbalance. And he pointed to elements in art, in poetry, in thought, in about 30 of them that were parallels between schizophrenia and modernism. And I thought, well, that's absolutely extraordinary.
You've said this particularly about the visual arts, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's true. It's true about a whole range of rather subtle perceptual attentional changes. The fragmentation, the abstraction, the preference for something that comments on rather than embodies something. All these elements, the loss of narrative in modernism, the sort of deliberate spurning of narrative. These are all aspects of the way in which he was suggesting there was a correlation between the world experienced by someone with schizophrenia and the world that had come about since about 1910. And, and that got me thinking, so if that's the case, and this it represents the left hemisphere sort of in overdrive and the right hemisphere dysfunctional, have there been examples before where there was a different balance? And I just started looking back through, because I've always been interested in the history of ideas. And I thought there was this clear pattern that civilizations begin with a good balance and then they move on.
I recently published a book called Conservatism and Grace, and when I try and find a metaphor for rationalism, I used the metaphor of, or perhaps the analogue, I should say, of autism.
Yes.
That's one I got really from both Andrew Pinsent and Roger Scruton. They both use that.
And I do too.
So you think that is also an analogue alongside schizophrenia?
Well, psychiatrists talk of the so-called schizo-autistic spectrum.
Right.
So there is a sort of, clearly not the same conditions, and indeed I would say that not all schizophrenia, not all autism is identical, under those headings. There are different types, but nonetheless, a very common thread in both schizophrenia and autism is this literal-minded, hyper-rationalistic, hyper-linguistic neglect of the implicit, of the social, of the emotional, and people with relatives with either of these conditions often write to me and say, you really help me understand what's going on.
Right.
So that's nice, a bit of proper sunshine.
Isn't it?
Yes. I came across recently in something that I'd written down many years ago, but because I'm a great lover of Hannah Arendt, and in her on totalitarianism, I think she says, the true candidate for being a Nazi or a Marxist is not somebody who believes passionately in this particular philosophy, but somebody who has simply lost all sense of what is true and what is false.
Right.
And resists all attempts to correct them by reference to science or facts. And we're definitely in that era. I mean, much of science now is politically incorrect, and you get even great, to their endless shame, you get an amazing journal like Nature, the most distinguished science magazine in the world, going right back to the early 19th century, saying that, certain things can't be said, even if true, in a science magazine. Well, this is appalling.
Do you see there to be in going back to Vico, because this seems to be very much in keeping with what you just said. He says that one of the characteristics of the second barbarism is the rise of superstitions. So there's this truncating of the mind where in which people begin to believe that whilst there's this narrow purview, they actually possess the fullness of what there is to know, and at the same time, as believing that they have a totally rational view of the world, they're actually committing themselves to a whole load of foundationless superstitions. And Vico says this is just typical of a declining civilization.
Yes.
Now, what you just described of, a prestigious journal saying, well, actually, there are certain things that may be true, but you can't say them. This seems to be at least akin to a superstition. That there are you can imagine in times past someone saying, well, that might be true, but if you say it, the fairies will get you, or something. It seems to be comparable in some way.
It's certainly a betrayal, because there is a place, surely, for people to pursue the noble and dignified and important goals of science, which should establish certain kinds of truth. They're always in process, because that's the history of science. It finds that what it used to believe it no longer believes. So it's not delivering an absolute eternal truth, but it is also a very important touchstone for orientating ourselves towards the world. And the trouble is that when we deny certain things because we think they're dangerous, we don't somehow get rid of that problem. We exacerbate that problem, we push it underground, and people are aware of it, and they're aware that they can no longer trust whatever it is that is propagating this kind of a philosophy. And when that's the case, you get polarization. So you get an angry discourse between people on the so-called right and the so-called left, who have most in common the fact that they have an extreme position, which is not nuanced. And it's so important to be able to say, there's this, and there's also that, and we need to find a way of synthesizing these and understanding them. And, if we're not doing that, then we're not entitled to call ourselves a civilization. Arendt says you're living in a tyranny when there are things that can't be said. He says it quite straightforward. Well, obviously in 2023 in Britain we live in a tyranny. I like the sort of position put forward, which is very similar to Vico's, by I'm not sure that he talks about Vico though, but Patrick Offals.
Right.
I never can remember whether he's William Offals or Patrick Offals. One is his real name, the other is his pseudonym.
Right.
And I'd love to say to him, mate, it's not the William or the Patrick that gives you away. It's the Offals. But anyway, there we are. But he's written this book immoderate greatness. And I suppose in brief what he suggests is that when a civilization is founded, there is a group of heroic people who make enormous sacrifices, acts of great bravery, of self-immolation in order to bring about the foundations of a society. And then there comes, after that has been reasonably consolidated, a period, the second phase, which is really what we are looking for in a civilization, when people can afford to study philosophy, to produce beautiful architecture, to produce music and painting, and a civilization flourishes. And then eventually there comes a phase, not too long after that, in which people take it as a given that they have this, and that it's their right to have it, and they don't have to put themselves out to keep it going or to mend it or to support it. It's their right that this thing exists in this way, and they become selfish and lazy and self-indulgent. They lack any sense of purpose or value and simply exploit what has been given them by the self-denial of their ancestors.
Do you think that there is an awakening going on, or a realization that a lot of these things you're discussing are in fact very real dangers? I mean, I've been surprised by the number of books written recently on tradition. Tim Stanley, Sohrab Ahmari, people are writing popular works about the importance of tradition, recovering a tradition, finding what's left of a traditional community and inducting yourself into it or being inducted into it. I was very surprised at the National Conservatism Conference in London that there were certain people who identify as conservatives turning up and talking about, maintaining the capitalist economy and doing this and doing that. But there were a lot of, interestingly, younger conservatives saying, well, no, by conservatism, what I really mean is family loyalties, a sense of national belonging, the importance of localism, what binds me to other people,
100%.
how certain economic arrangements and technological innovations are undermining things like rich friendships.
Yes.
They were saying these things.
Yes.
It was very powerful to see this difference.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether, as, if you like, left brain dominance is escalating, there's also an increasing awareness that this is a real threat. They might not put it in those terms, but there is a real threat here, and it's dehumanizing, and there's a pushback.
Yes, it's interesting about the different kinds of conservatism, and there is somewhere on the net where you can do an exercise. They ask you 250 questions, and they place you on a scale.
Right, okay.
And I was astonished to find that I was in the most radical left-leaning
Right.
sector. And mainly this was because they were evaluating conservatism as believing in large corporations, capitalism and so on. And I think capitalism is... what can one say about capitalism? It's something that... I have no ready answer to what's better than it, but it is a very destructive expression of the left hemisphere's point of view.
Right.
Which dissolves social bonds instead, puts people in competition with one another, and everybody's kind of clambering to outmaneuver someone else. This is a very bad way to arrange a civilization. When people say, well, what do you want in its place? I certainly don't want a dirigiste regime. Actually, what I say is a benign version of feudalism. And I don't know quite what that would be, but it might be where you were allowed to vote for and overthrow a feudal overlord, but it was a structure of society in which, there was mobility, but largely speaking, it wasn't just about everybody being isolated and competing with everyone else, but holding certain elements of a functioning society together, and that this was also a noble way to spend your time.
Well, Tolkien, who I think was a rather right brain
Yes.
thinker. He said that his ideal form of political regime is something between an absolute monarchy and anarchism, which sounds quite similar.
Yes, yes. But all those things that you mentioned, localization rather than globalization, and loyalty to community, loyalty to country, loyalty to a sense of place, that places are not just constructs that we can do anything we like with, but have a history like a growing organism. I mean, the substitution of the idea of a mechanism, which is really behind all the left-leaning philosophies, that it can be remade in any way, is to misunderstand an organism. And societies, like living individuals, are organisms. And in the matter of things, in the chapter 12 on biology, I point out the 8 approximately ways in which organisms differ from mechanisms. So that's an important first step. But the other thing that I think is so important is to do with values. I bang on about values rather a lot these days, but it's because in the writing of the matter of things, I realised that values had to be sort of up there along with matter and consciousness, and that they are not, emphatically not, things that we invent, but things that we either discover or fail to discover, that they are aspects of consciousness, and I believe consciousness to be an ontological primitive, i.e. you cannot generate it from anything else, it is its own thing and foundational in the cosmos. And there are aspects of consciousness. Consciousness is always disposed towards something, and the way in which it is disposed expresses value. And one way I talk about that is through attention. Attention is the way you dispose your consciousness, and it's affected by your concerns, your purposes, and your values. And when you were talking about the, what was it called, the National Conservatism
Conference.
Which I wasn't aware of, what was coming to mind was Shaler's hierarchy of values, which I'm talked about before, but he had this idea that there were hierarchies of values, and at the bottom was the basest value, which was just utility and pleasure. But that after that there came the Lebenswerte, and these seem to be just the category that young people are seeing are important, but are completely underemphasized, perhaps going missing in our society. Those above all of loyalty, fidelity. So if you say you're going to do something, being reliable that you are going to do that, and that you're not going to suddenly cheat on somebody, but are going to, your honor is that you will do what you said you were going to do. Magnanimity, a sense of bravery, being honest even if it's difficult. These things are very important values that we've seemed to have lost in the dog-eats-dog version of capitalism. Yes. And very down-to-earth and simple reflection is that when American corporations took over many of the successful British corporations in the City of London during the 70s, 80s and 90s, there was a complete change of values, that effectively the only thing that mattered was the bottom line. I've heard this from so many people working there. And they used to say, I really used to enjoy my job. I knew who to trust. I knew I was valued. I knew there were other things going on in people's heads than just how much money. Yeah. But that was dispensed with. And the point is that was not just a human calamity, it was an economic calamity, because a lot of these organizations, huge ones, then began to fail as people realized that, concentrating on the bottom line alone is a way of committing suicide.
Right.
And I love the story of Japanese Airlines, which had gone bankrupt, and they appointed a Zen monk in his 70s to look after it. And within 18 months, he had turned the corporation around, returned it to profitability, floated it on the stock exchange. And he just had different values, which were, yes, of course, we need to be able to be profitable. But in order to do that, and for other reasons as well, we need to look after the other human aspects of our organisations.
What you're saying is very similar, it seems to me, to the I-thou thesis of Martin Buber.
It is.
There are two ways of attending. And one of those ways reduces, I think he says, everything to utility and information.
Yes.
And the other is to use his term, encounter.
Yes.
You see the analogue there with...
Profoundly so, yes. I mean, I suggest that all experience is an encounter. In fact, everything that exists is an encounter, a process, a relational process, and therefore an encounter with something, out of which both parties of the encounter are, or all parties of the encounter in some cases, are changed. So an encounter never leaves you unchanged, it never leaves whatever it is you're encountering unchanged.
Yeah.
So that is the nature of it. I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, Buber unhelpfully distinguishes between experience and encounter. And experience, he says, is the I-it relation. Encounter is the I-thou relation, which I'm not sure is the best way to speak about it. But his solution, of course, is a spiritual one. He thinks that we need to develop spiritual practices that foster a way of attending to the world that habituates encounter. And I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who's talking over Zoom. He's a monk who lives in the Alps, and I've known him for a decade and a half, and he was talking about the act of adoration. That several times every day you should stop and be aware that you're a real thing, a real object in the world, that your existence wasn't necessary, that every moment of your existence is gratuitous, and you should be aware of the reality of everything around you, and be in an act of thanksgiving at that moment, and that this is something that you should stop and do every day, because because when you develop the habit of adoration, in his view, your reality changes completely, which I suppose is not entirely dissimilar to the practice of mindfulness that you've talked about.
It's like the practice of mindfulness in that being there and simply being open. But it adds in this element of adoration and thanksgiving. Traditionally in Christianity, prayers are divided into acts, ACTS, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. And I know that a number of people, including St. Francis, have certainly waged war on supplication. He says, when you pray, you should ask for nothing. And I think that's right. What has seemed to me most important is, in fact, adoration and thanksgiving. And alongside of that, I was, when you were saying, I was remembering something that I was told by somebody about Orthodox Jews, that they should have two little seeds or stones or whatever in their pocket, and on one of them, as it were, it is written, or it is metaphorically written, "This whole universe was made just for you," and on the other is, "You are as nothing but a speck of dust in relation to the cosmos." Yeah. And to be able to hold those two together seems very important, which is another thing that I find myself constantly recurring to, the need to keep two positions that our modern way of thinking would think are simply contrary, are not simply contrary, they are the way in which contraries need to be held together.
That's a major theme in the mystical tradition of Christianity. Yeah, I was quite shocked when I went through a long period of reading people like Catherine of Siena and Teresa of Avila, and they speak about this way. You're almost shocked by their sense of self-importance. You know, the God incarnated, thinking of me, and he suffered to save me, and I was worthy of that in his eyes. And then in the next sentence, I am as nothing. I am a worm before you. And they constantly oscillate between these two. For them, these two truths that might seem irreconcilable.
Well, once again, I think the conjunction of opposites is something that our way of thinking simply cannot, does not compute.
Yeah.
But is essential to an understanding of what we should be doing, because so often we think in linear terms, and we think that a certain move is a good one, and therefore further moves in the same direction will be better and better, which they rarely are.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up your comment that Buber and others have cast this in the light of the spiritual.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that in Scheele's pyramid there are two further levels of value, the top one being the holy, and that between that and the so-called Lebenswerte of faithfulness, magnanimity, courage, that kind of thing, are those three Platonic ideals of beauty, goodness and truth, and that they again are casualties of our age. It is so important to a functioning civilization. And I wrote about them, of course, in the chapter on value, but I've been thinking more about Whitehead's remark that, aesthetics, I can't remember exactly what his remark was, but it sort of echoes Dostoevsky's idea that the world will be saved by beauty. I've always had this slight worry about that, because goodness and truth are absolutely non-impugnable, but beauty can deceive, and beauty can be in the service of something not so good. So I've always had this debate with myself about the nature of beauty, and Keats's famous lines, if you're only 26, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. I mean, to that I've often thought, well, that's not right, and that's the reason why we have two different words. So, have you any thoughts on that?
Well, it's not obvious to me that they're always reconciled.
No, well, and in, I think the matter with things, I draw attention to the existence in Greek of a definite article, so that it's not just possible to describe something as kalos, beautiful, but to have to kalon, the beauty, the beautiful in the abstract, and that this is, it no doubt has its value, but it also is dangerous, because it makes it possible to abstract from this particular case. However, that's in the service of analysis, and analysis has its place.
So I'm keen to pursue this this notion of the spiritual practice as a way to bring about hemispheric balance, if I can put it that way. Because I was very surprised. As I said, I listened to your Unheard discussion on the way up with my brother, and I was surprised at the moment in that exchange at which you said, well, you need to start praying again. We really need to start. And you said, not in this sense of, God suddenly going to come down and sort it all out or whatever, but in the sense of habituating this practice of being grateful, of humbling oneself. It's very easy for us, I think, to assume that people were always as we are. But actually, you walk around the old towns of European cities, and you go through France, and you see on every corner a little shrine, or whatever. I mean, I left the UK when I was 19 years old and went and lived for a year on my own in India, precisely just because I wanted to see what a culture would look like that treated eternal questions as if they were cultural questions. And that is what you see everywhere in India. Everything is religious. Everything is religious. There's almost no distinction between the secular and the sacral. And I wonder whether we can start to bring back a little bit of balance. You once said in a conversation, I'm not sure where, but it stuck with me, that somebody asked you, what would the world look like if it was right hemisphere dominant? And you said, well, it would look very balanced. And I just wonder whether some of that balance could be brought back, not so much by thinking through conceptually the issues, but by developing ongoing practices that enable us to embody some of these ideas.
I'm sure that is necessary. The interesting thing to me is that, as I always have to emphasize, it's not like the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere are alternatives. And it's not like, well, we've gone too far this way to be able to move back that way.
You're right.
It's that they function in a completely different way, in that the right hemisphere already knows and incorporates what the left hemisphere knows. The left hemisphere doesn't know and incorporate what the right hemisphere knows.
Okay.
So what one is looking for is a balance, which would never just be a symmetrical balance between these two ways of thinking, but one in which the right hemisphere was able to take what the left hemisphere is designed to give it and take that up into something greater. If it's left at the level of the left hemisphere's understanding, it simply results in greater and greater power, greater and greater utility, because that is the raison d'etre of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere evolved evolutionarily to further our ability to manipulate and to have power over the environment.
To grab.
Sorry?
To grab.
To grab,
Yeah.
And so it's never going to be an equal partner. It's never going to be welcome in that role as let's get a balance here between the two. The balance comes from the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere being able to play its role in that, because, as I'm always saying, there's nothing wrong with the left hemisphere. It's
Sure.
very important. It's just that it goes wrong when it thinks it's the one that understands, which it doesn't.
Do you think that what you have presented as, because it seems to me that it almost works like an avalanche, as there is this takeover of the left hemisphere, there's also the culture itself starts to foster that.
Yes.
And then certain disciplines or certain ways of thinking start becoming excluded. Even the lexicon no longer lends itself to describing those things, and it's almost it accelerates and accelerates. It's almost impossible to get out of it. And then it seems to me, and this is something perhaps you've talked less about, but I certainly see it in the way you live, that as I say, that avalanche starts to become visible even in the landscape. The way that we build, the way that we develop the land, the way that we industrialize agriculture, all of this sort of thing, the rise of brutalist architecture and all of that. The question for me is the unraveling of a civilization, because I think we have to love our civilization. We have to see that this incredible deposit of classical thought and Christian mysticism and an architectural tradition, our common law tradition, all of these things that have made a life that transcends barbarism possible is something we need to be very grateful for. And if you see it unraveling, the question for me is always, is that just inevitable? Is that the way things are? Or for those who see that, are there initiatives to first slow it down and to actually reverse it altogether? And increasingly as you talk, I wonder, is that actually the job not of theoretical thinkers, but of storytellers, of bards, of artists, figures like this?
Could be. I suppose the trouble with the society that we live in is that although we pay lip service to artists, and you can even find, some hedge fund or something that employs an artist in residence. This is kind of window dressing, and I don't know how deep it goes, because those people still see real life as what they do in their dreary offices in London under strip lighting during the day, and that when they go and listen to Mozart in the evening at Covent Garden,
it's recreation.
This is just recreation or relaxation, worse. Whereas it may be the only point in the day in which they've had contact with reality. So we need to... It's a difficult one. I think you're right that this is certainly what I have always thought, that when there are instabilities, they can be often corrected by a process of negative feedback. But there comes a point when things are so far out of kilter that positive feedback, the avalanche you spoke about, begins to happen, and then it's a very difficult thing to reverse. But I do think we've all got to speak out. And so the first thing I think should happen, because the only argument people listen to nowadays is money. And if universities are so far from fulfilling their obligations to further freedom of thought that they connive with people who wish to silence anybody who has views different from their own, if that is the case, the argument should be your grant will be cut by 5% every year per event that you sanction the banning of. So every time somebody is denied a platform, you lose some of the government funding. I mean, it's a practical step, and it's a reasonable step in my view. There's just no place for no platforming in a university.
So, but you have talked about, you were talking about Arendt earlier, and the primary characteristic of a tyranny is to say, you cannot say that here. But you've also talked about the seriousness of tradition and being inducted into a tradition. And one of the things that traditions have to do is render certain things taboo in order to protect themselves. And it's not obvious to me how to reconcile those two things.
Well, I don't think it's difficult at all. There are already perfectly good laws for incitement to hatred, and I'm not suggesting, that we should get rid of those laws.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is somebody putting forward a point of view that happens not to be consonant with a certain doctrine or dogmatic position held by
the new orthodoxy.
The new orthodoxy, and it's not the job of the university to go, oh yes, you're right, but to say you need to wake up, grow up, and learn something.
Yeah.
So that's my position on that, and it's really only a starting point for making the much more important point, is that we need to defend our tradition. There are things that have been wrong in our tradition. There are things that are wrong in every tradition. But there's also much to be grateful for, really an enormous amount that's been achieved in the West. And although I'm one of the West's great critics, I'm also, in the coincidence of opposites, one of the West's great admirers, valuers of what we have brought about in terms of the degree of tolerance and all the things that are now backfiring on us.
Yeah, yeah.
So we should. There are a number of movements that I don't particularly like, and as usual they require a bit of finesse in expressing them. So, for example, I don't like the way in which people just attack humanity as some sort of squalid apes. I think we need to regain respect for what humanity is capable of at its best, which is something completely extraordinary. And this is not in any way to denigrate our oneness with the animal world, which I also hugely believe in. I believe in the sacredness of all living things, as Blake said and St. Francis said. So I don't see humanity as somehow in opposition to that, but as, in some sense, a kind of fulfillment.
Sure.
To a point. I'm not saying it's the end of evolution, because if we survive, we'll evolve further. But all I'm really saying is that it's a mistake to denigrate humanity, and nothing good will come of denigrating humanity. We need to regain self-belief, and that means regaining belief in what is human about us, not what is machine-like about us. And much of what we're doing at the moment is trying to improve a kind of information processing, which is really all that the I in AI stands for, artificial information processing. It has nothing to do with intelligence. But intelligence is something very special, a kind of understanding that we are losing of what it is we're dealing with. Only a sort of mechanistic, cognitivist idea of the human is being expressed. I know that if you stop people and ask them, they'll say, no, there's more to humanity than that. But that's different from the way in which the public discourse is carried on.
Yeah.
So we need to regain respect for humanity, respect for our own culture, and not constantly taking a sledgehammer and a pneumatic drill to it. There's a proper place for saying, yes, these things were probably wrong, or were very wrong. But every culture will have them, and it's not good just to focus on those.
You seem to say a lot of things that were hinted at by Michael Oakeshott in the sort of middle of the last century. He was very anxious about a privileging of technical knowledge over experiential knowledge. The seeing all knowledge as, if you like, coming from a guidebook or a manual, rather than the ongoing experience of a trade or whatever. The rejection of implicit knowledge as not valid.
Michael Polanyi too.
Yes, Polanyi exactly was making these arguments. But of course, these are largely forbidden authors now in the university.
The thing is this, you see, we're afraid. And when we're afraid, and I understand why we're afraid, people don't want, they say in private, if I say anything like this in public, I may lose my job, I'll certainly lose my grant, I will lose my research assistance, whatever it is. My life will be made difficult, impossible, and I wholly understand why you don't want to do that. But what we've got to do is find a way of generating a milieu in which people don't feel that, and that's why and a lot of people will think that's a terrible idea to defund universities if they block free thinking. But I think that it'd have to be, thought out in a reasonable way, but that has to be the start, because then people can begin to talk at last about things they don't dare talk about now. And we haven't got a lot of time to change things so that we can recover some degree of wisdom. Wisdom is, if ever there was a society that was not marked by the level of its wisdom, it's got to be this one.
Right.
The most extraordinary barbarities and stupidities are voiced all the time, and we've got to somehow change that discourse. And what I think is that if we could create that shift, in answer to your question, is it too late or can we do anything? I think we would be able to do something because there's an enormous number of people who want to see things moving in a direction that probably you and I would both agree with and value.
Sure.
And I've posted on my website an account of the Puritans in Antwerp going around destroying the monuments and so on. It's from the British ambassador at the time in the Lowlands, the Netherlands. And what he describes is a city of 10,000 people perhaps, and a small band of people, 10, 12, going around in a very disciplined way, going into buildings with sledgehammers, breaking up statues, smashing glass, burning manuscripts, destroying paintings, and the rest of the population sort of looking on in a kind of amazement. When I read that, I thought, this is exactly where we're at now. The loud-mouthed are taking sledgehammers to our civilization and to the greatness of art, to goodness and to truth and to beauty and to the sacred. And we are baffled and standing back going, well, this is the end, I suppose. I don't know what we do.
Sociologists talk about 3% of the population. You need 3% of the population to overthrow a regime, to have a revolution, anything like that. Everyone else will just go along with it, just assuming that is the tide, the direction.
Well, we need to turn the tide. Well, that's almost one of its defining features.
That's true. I think that's an observation of all sensible people. What I argue in my latest book is that conservatism privileges concrete realities over concepts.
Absolutely.
It treats the concrete as more real than the theoretical.
And to that extent, it very much merges with the right-left hemisphere thing.
I think that the genuine right stems from the right hemisphere.
People often say to me, clearly the right hemisphere is left in politics and the left hemisphere is right in politics. And I say, well, I don't think so. It depends very much what you're talking about. There's a kind of leftist politics which is right hemisphere, but a lot of it's very left hemisphere.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of rightist politics that is left hemisphere, but a lot of it's very right hemisphere. And part of the difference is, well, let me say something about what I think about about conservatism. It's the view that life is a flow, that it is continuous, that the past shapes and is present in the present, and the present has a duty to the future, and so it is a seamless flow, and that is very different from the idea of snapshots in which time is broken up and you recreate things just like that out of God knows what. And this is very theory driven. It's typically, the great thing about theories, maps and representations is that they have simplicity on their side, but not wisdom.
Yes. And they're episodic, almost inherently.
They're inherently episodic, and they are inherently naive. And that effectively the fruits of experience are something else. And the big mistake is to imagine that, I mean, obviously one sense of conservatism, and one that is really central, I'm sure, is that to try and understand things that are valuable, that have been bequeathed to us, and not to destroy them willfully.
Yes.
But it's also not about stasis. And my original idea of there being a flow is very important. And, you know, if you look back to the Renaissance was a time in which people looked back to the Greeks and the Romans in order to make the most staggering leaps forward that have been made in the history of any civilization.
The first page of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, he says, a society without the means to change cannot survive.
Exactly.
So that is completely...
And also, a society that has no tradition cannot change.
Cannot change properly.
It cannot change properly.
Yeah.
It can do all kinds of drastic upheavals that destroy generations of people, cause misery and impoverishment across the globe.
On this point of conservatism seeing itself as belonging to the ongoing story or flow of history rather than a perfect example of this is the conservative response to the Enlightenment conception of rights.
Yes.
You know, you have people like Rousseau and Diderot in particular talking about the rights of man per se.
Yes.
And the conservative response to that in the 18th century was, well, hold on a minute. Rather than talking about these abstract, unanchored rights.
Yes. Not anchored in time or space or place.
Right. It seems that what you're trying to talk about, and this is very much both the Burkean and the Maestrian point, what you seem to be attempting to talk about are the ongoing negotiation about liberties that people have tried to argue for, to make life tolerable, and are reluctant to see undermined.
But this is very different because it's saying, number one, we exist in time.
Exactly.
And secondly, it's saying that we can't understand who we are unless we understand where we've come from.
Exactly.
Yes.
So without history,
and we can't
without living in history, or as Robin Collingwood would then extend it into the historical imagination, which is terribly close to the idea of living in the world of art. Without history, we're just isolated dots, aren't we?
Exactly.
And this is what the conservative. Oh, cheers! Thank you so much, Dominic.
Yes.
Well,
thank you
you.
so
Well,
much.
it's lovely
You're,
having you
you're
both.
doing very much here to make sure that we're not isolated dots.
Somebody once said to me in a debate that I was a backward-looking person.
Yep.
And I said, well, I can't look forward because it hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
So the only thing I can do is, if I want to learn, I want to know who I am. Yes. I want to know what my society is. I have to attend to its story. And I have to be a backward-looking person. I have to be someone formed by history if I want to be wise about the present. Sorry to reach you.
That's really my point, and so I wouldn't accept the concept of backward-looking except in a technical sense. That only a fool would simply deny the importance of the sum of human experience and wisdom to date, and imagine that you, Fred Bloggs, living in Basingstoke, have got the answer to the meaning of life.
Right.
I mean, on the whole, we'd do better if we pay attention to those who have come before us and often won their wisdom the hard way. So in that sense, but I think in other senses, we're more concerned about what we bequeath to the future. And that's partly why we don't want everything just destroyed by a band of people now who think, because of a reason they thought up in their adolescence, that this would be a good thing just to get rid of.
Yeah. We have to overcome the communitarian individualist dichotomy altogether. I think it's just plainly false.
Completely agree.
You discover yourself as an individual precisely by being inducted into your community, not by being emancipated out of it. It's through the web of relations
That we are what we are.
Exactly.
But is there not a certain kind of dialectic where, indeed, at the beginning, we only exist in the context of our family? How could we exist otherwise as defenceless infants?
Absolutely.
And then there are different stages of realisation of connection, which we see played out.
There's a seamless process that occurs in the development of any fulfilled human individual, which is that they begin fused with their mother. So they're never completely atomistic or alone. What they have to learn is some degree of separation, which they do. But that separation never means derision and alienation. It means that there is now a reciprocity of two. And that then goes on to a reciprocity of several and many. And who you are is very much something you owe to the society that formed you, and you hope, if you lead a good life, to be able to give back to that society.
Yes.
So you're never this isolated individual.
And I think there's a point in your life when simply you become aware of that. You see yourself as if from without, and you realise that this strange thing in the world that you are is this thing that has unfolded out of your national belonging, your local belonging, your family loyalties, your various experiences and so on.
Yes.
And I think the worst thing you can tell someone, which is what Rousseau did, he told the world that the moment you discover yourself to be that thing, there's an imperative to emancipate yourself from it,
Yeah.
rather than to cherish it and be grateful for it and to honour it.
Which would be, very much along the lines of Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Although, as we were discussing the other day,
Dominic, I want to say this is really yummy.
it's worked out very well, hasn't it? Yeah.
It's jolly good.
And it's one of the easiest things to do. You
Oh,
just
it's so yummy.
cook it slowly and ignore it.
And the wine
Yeah,
is
that's
lovely.
right. Now, I discovered that a while back. I came from the south with ideas that you could cook very young lamb rather pink, but actually the secret is to you get these old hogs and you put them put them in the oven and let them, and it's delicious.
Yeah.
I think there is a great shift happening in our understanding of what conservatism is, and I think there's I think there is a renaissance actually. There is a recovery of the original inspiration of historically based anti-revolutionary thought, in which and people are overcoming these kind of this free market fetishism, this Thatcherite, Reaganite sort of valueless view of conservatism.
Ghastly. And
It's ghastly.
Not what I mean by conservatism at all.
At all.
Now, if you call conservative neoliberalism of the kind we've just been describing, then I believe, the gap is huge, but it's a gap both with the progressives, so-called, and with the so-called conservatives.
Yeah.
No, you're right.
Because from a progressive standpoint, and I've been very impressed with some of the SNP people I've come across.
Right.
The idea of delegating to local communities.
Yeah.
The idea of fairness. The idea that it's good if rich people live in communities. And the idea that we have rich and poor living in fairly close proximity and amicably.
Yes.
Now, is that leftist stuff? We might sort of
Well, I think the terms
put a label on it of that kind, but it's pretty meaningless, isn't it?
I think the terms left and right should be superannuated. They really they don't cut the mustard anymore. No, I was saying earlier, there's somewhere online where you can go and answer 250 questions. It puts you on into one of 4 quadrants of a graph. And I was astonished to discover that I was in the most radical leftist position, because effectively most of the questions that concerned conservatism were about things like, do I believe it's important that corporations should have untrammeled ability to do whatever they wish? And I said, sort of, not on the whole. And did I care about, the condition of all people of different economic status in the country? And I said I did. But this is old-fashioned conservatism.
Yeah, it would place Burke and Disraeli on the extreme left. Yeah.
And no, I wouldn't want to bash Margaret Thatcher, but I'm very sad about what she did to the professions by making them conform to a business model, and I think thereby destroyed very important relationships within the community, with the doctor, with the teacher, with the priest, and so on. Everything became sort of bureaucratic and operationalized in some commercial way. Except that now it's got mixed up with all sorts of box ticking that academics feel they've got to indulge in instead of getting on with the business of propagating.
But isn't this
learning.
the point? Because when you were talking earlier, before we sat down to dinner, about who creates this movement of bureaucratization, I was thinking immediately, well, it's ourselves. When I say ourselves, not round this table, but it's very easy and tempting to abdicate responsibility. So when you come back to the question, cui bono,
I agree.
a bureaucratic system suits a lot of people incredibly well.
Because they don't have to get involved.
Yeah.
But in fact, they do get involved. This is my point about doctors, that everybody thinks somebody is getting away with something here, but actually nobody is getting away with anything. Everybody is brought down by it, even the people who run it. And if people really understood what the costs of bureaucracy were on their time, which is their life really, they would be able to make a sort of sensible way up of, well, of course there are risks. There are always risks in life, but how much do we want to be giving up to a box-ticking and immensely complex process which may go on for hours online, and in the end doesn't really mean anything because it doesn't change anything or achieve any of the goals that we would want. It's simply a waste of everybody's time, including the bureaucrats.
So what do you think really happened at the end of the Renaissance, that period between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment? So
Before the Counter-Reformation.
No, after.
Yeah.
A century after. You know, what was really? I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because the Counter-Reformation is a case in point, where, I mean, if you read the seminary manuals of the Counter-Revolution, of the Counter-Reformation, they are hyper rationalistic. It's a total left brain overload in theology.
To deal with the Reformation on its own terms, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah, it was an attempt to say there was such a sense that the Reformation had undermined the human intellect's ability to know things independently of faith commitments. Because Luther's doctrine was very much, you can know the truth when you assent to the content of the scripture, and that's it. And the Catholic intellectual tradition was so keen to defend the notion that actually the human intellect was capable of possessing truth as a prerequisite for having faith, there ended up being this desire to form watertight arguments from reason alone. And so they ended up conceding a huge amount of territory to what eventually became the Enlightenment, which was a totally naturalistic, totally rationalistic force in European society. And it was in some ways prepared by the Catholic intellectual tradition's response to the Reformation. And in fact, a lot of Catholic clergy were early Enlightenment thinkers.
I have to confess that if I'd been alive at that time, perhaps particularly in France, I'd probably have been an enthusiast for the Enlightenment.
For the Revolution. And,
Well, yes, because there was so much that did need some sort of correction.
yeah.
And as always, we've just taken things far too far.
And it didn't
The success in a small area doesn't mean that this is the way to do everything.
And it didn't leave the right brain behind. I always was struck by Kant talking about the moral law within and the starry heavens above. Was seemed to me to be a very nice description of the fusion of the lobes.
But it's also a very aggressive separation of the two, rather than seeing the contiguity that exists.
Is that true?
I think in
The
Kant,
way Kant described it?
in Kant in particular,
I wouldn't accept it anyway. As a description of hemisphere difference, no.
Yeah.
Because I think what he was talking about was awe before something that he couldn't comprehend how it came about and where it came from. And in one sense that was to do with the existence of a moral law at all, how we developed it. And the other was the extension of the cosmos and its awe-inspiring nature. I think what happened in a way was the over-enthusiasm of what's called the scientific revolution phase, which was, sort of operative, I suppose, from the middle of the 17th century.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that the more you want to exclude things, and there are good reasons for wanting to do that, the more you narrow down to a certain way of thinking about things that is itself exclusive of things that are going to be important. So you end up with a vision in which you're going to remove almost everything that can't be measured. So consciousness is something other than matter. Values and purpose, which are intrinsic to every single thing a human being does, every action we take, every thought we have, are governed by these things. We take them out, and then we inspect the resulting mass and say, can't find any values or purpose in it. The image I rather like is one from Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost, not on this topic, but where he says, it's as if a policeman were to stop the traffic in the street and then take out his notebook and solemnly write, the silence in this street is very suspicious.
Isn't that also Collingwood talking about materialists essentially sawing off the branch they sit on?
Sawing off the branch.
Because you'll always have to go to the further question, and you will never ever be able to escape the metaphysical question.
No. And there's an aspect of sawing off the branch which I think is particularly relevant at the moment, to come away from history and back to philosophical debate now. And there is a tendency for people, and when I say people, I'm thinking partly of Donald Hoffman, whose insight and intellect I admire, but who nonetheless has this vision, which is really a sort of pre-Kantian or Kantian vision, that all we ever know is a read-off of dials inside the head. We don't really get any contact with reality. And he also thinks that he can show that time doesn't exist, because if you take time out of certain equations, they work much more easily. But there's a number of responses to that. But the one that I wanted to draw attention to is that if you entertain a description of the world which removes the meaning of time and probably space, but certainly time, you pull the rug from under the feet of science, because science can only deal with experience. It is an empirical science. And if the foundations of everything we experience are going to be denied, then we've got nothing left to test our theory against.
Well, it's experience that can be observed, which implies space and time.
Needs to be observed. I mean, well, nothing you can even say, never mind observe, makes any sense in a context which denies the existence of space or time. So I think what's happening is a mistake that Bohr averted to, which is that when we're practicing science, we're not actually getting at we're not claiming that we're getting at the true reality. What we're doing is creating a model which accommodates as many aspects of an observed experience as is possible.
Yes.
The best model. And that's what I think Bohr and his generation did for physics. It's now beginning to happen in biology, and that's wonderful.
What you were saying reminded me very much of the famous debate between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins, in which John Lennox said, you know, all science presupposes that there's some correspondence between our judgment and the world out there. Yeah. And if you're not prepared to say that the world out there is in some way a product of mind, then you can't explain why there is some correspondence between mind and the world out there. Right. And he waited for an answer from Dawkins and never got one.
Something I think that's underappreciated in the West, that all creativity involves some form of negative interference, some sort of resistance. And if you like, again, it's rather like the filter that allows certain things through but resists other things. And it's part of creation. And you know, the simplest possible observation on the subject is that what is friction? Well, friction is what stops motion, but it's also what starts motion. And I'm absolutely convinced that we've neglected something important in seeing that resistance as part of the coincidentia oppositorium is one of the creative elements And so when we try to remove all the barriers to a certain way of thinking or doing, we're actually stripping out the creativity and stripping out the possibility for something greater to come about.
Yes,
But we knew
Because I do believe in a sort of Hegelian way that these things that are both aspects of the same thing need to be in an oppositional relationship before rising to an Aufhebung, which is a resolution on a higher level.
Yes,
and which we all learnt at school. Well, that was our practice very much, wasn't it?
I don't think Hegel was part of my curriculum.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I
but
went to a very
Gordon-
inferior
Gordon-
school.
Gordon Perry would have been very
Well,
particular
but
there.
it's important what you say, because obviously the Hegel has been interpreted by many people, like Roger Scruton, like Mark Dooley, like Bob Grant, as a conservative. I mean, it's interesting what you said earlier, that you would have been tempted to join the revolution had you been in France in 1780.
Well, not the revolution exactly. I think I'd have been more circumspect than to do that, but I would have been very tempted by...
Or sympathetic.
Sympathetic to Enlightenment philosophy, not to the revolution.
But what's interesting about someone like Joseph de Maistre is that he never, ever, in any of his works, argued for a return to the Ancien Regime. No. He absolutely saw that there was a serious problem, and so he is an example of somebody who sees the good in the historical deposit, sees the necessity for change, and he wants to see this synthesis acting creatively to bring about a post-revolutionary epoch that isn't one of repudiation.
Well, that reminds me of Kant's little essay, What is Enlightenment?
Yeah.
Which is a lovely and beautifully written and accessible piece, where obviously he's kind of...
You and I feel very differently about that.
But I thought it was beautifully written. Why do you dislike it?
Well, because I think it's wrong.
It's a good enough reason.
In what respect?
He argues that the Enlightenment is man coming to maturity.
Yeah.
And I think that the Enlightenment is the moment at which man is plunged into an adolescent way of...
Into sort of adolescent hubris,
yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, no, I would agree with you
Or
there,
maybe mistaking adolescence for maturity.
Well,
Yeah, which adolescents tend to do.
Also, if it was a
fair
world...
point. Yeah.
If it was going to be a world peopled by professors from Königsberg who enjoyed good lunches, then he would probably have had history on his side.
Yes, well, he committed the humane error, which is, Hume thought that you didn't need a foundation for morality because you had these good feelings and good dispositions. Because this is typical of somebody who spends his whole life around gentlemen who want to treat each other in a benign way. Go to Glasgow on a Friday night and see if that's still working. You've talked a lot about being able to hold two things that seem in tension together. A lot of people have given examples like the fact that Shakespeare, the very thing that makes him universal is that he's so archetypally English. And the moment you try to claim a universal applicability, you actually become alienated from every instantiation of the truth.
Well, I think that's like Goethe's idea that you find the universal through the particular, not by turning your back on the particular. So I do agree about that the particularity is very important.
How does that work?
Well, I think it works in exactly the way that was suggested, that this is... if you try to rip out the Italian-ness of Dante or the Spanishness of Cervantes, or whatever, you're going to lose a sense of what is universal, because you'll have denatured something very human. So I think that we need to turn our backs away from this idea that we should neutralize anything that speaks of any locale or any individuality, because I think actually the purpose of the cosmos, the way in which it unfolds and works, is the further and greater unfolding of individuality, not in opposition to the whole, but in a fulfillment of the whole. So I sometimes say it's like a flower that when it opens out from the bud and becomes this wonderful complex, whatever it is, it hasn't in some way negated the bud. It has in fact fulfilled the bud by being that complexity. And so in that way, I think we need to sophisticate our ideas of what we're talking about when we talk about nationality. That there is no necessary divarication between the existence of a coherent culture and change. These things are part of one and the same thing, and many of the most heinous crimes of the last 150 years have been committed by people who failed to understand this and thought that some theory or some ideal that they had invented should supplant what was organically there.
Sure.
Why did that become such an issue in the last 150 years?
Industrialization might be one answer. In other words, a sort of furtherance of the Enlightenment goal of sort of everything being equal and universal, but achieved through mechanisms and through the aggregation of power in the hands of certain industrialists.
On a greater scale.
Yes, on a greater scale. So that we've entered a world in which we've unfortunately lost the sense of the uniqueness of place, of landscape, of a way of doing and a way of thinking that belongs to a people. We've now begun to suspect this as something terrible, but I think on the grounds that somehow it will exclude people, but that's not necessarily the case at all. And interestingly, talking to patients, I lived and worked 10 years in the southeast of London in a deprived area in which there were lots of immigrants. And what I noticed very strongly was that people who had immigrated there some time ago were far less resentful of British culture and anything to do with Britain than were their children born perhaps 20, 25 years ago. And it's interesting because I suppose they have been taught a culture in which they see whatever it was that Britain represented as somehow tyrannical.
Yeah.
That they saw that and reported that and felt that, despite the fact that their parents didn't feel or see that to the same degree at all.
If we may, I just want to go back to this. I was surprised when you answered Dominic's question that you immediately pointed to industrialization. Not because I think it's wrong, but because I think there's something deep there. The machine, the existence of the machine is very interesting because when you're dealing with an organism, you need to know things like what does it relate to, what grows next to it, what's the soil, what's the history like, where does the sun hit, how often does it rain? You know, you have to. There are a huge number of contextual questions that you need to familiarize yourself with. When you're dealing with a machine, you need to know what the manual is. The machinist and the gardener they just approach the world and they approach the sphere of their activity with a completely different understanding of how to operate.
But I think here there may be some movement, because I thought Iain was going to talk about Entfremdung and alienation.
Just let me follow the thought to the end and then tell me all the reasons it's wrong. If and I accept it's a big if, but if that's right, that the way the machinist approaches his sphere of activity is radically different, thank you so much, to that of the gardener. And if the machine is, and again it's a big if the machine is characterized in the way I've described so far, then the machine is as close as an existent object can be to an abstraction, right?
No, absolutely.
But there's a big chunk of premise in there, a very big chunk. So first of all, It's assuming a degree of routinization, standardization, loss of agency, etc., which in the Industrial Revolution would not have been true of a skilled worker anyway.
Well, that's not true, and there's a lot of literature about this concerning precisely the Industrial Revolution. So a very good example of this are the women who were spinning.
Right. But this was, I think, probably the more sinister aspect of the Industrial Revolution, which is that
I think there were quite a few sinister
before we went into.
I think there's rather a lot to the sinister.
but to develop this particular point, when we were all in the cottage with our looms and wheels, we were kind of all in it together. Once we went into the mill, then there were the women who would simply do the treadle or move the thing back and forth as the steam engine moved the loop along. But then you would also have had what, technically speaking, are the machinists, who would have been people who were responsible for the maintenance of the machine, who would have had to understand its vagaries and all the rest of it. Those people would have had a far less degree of alienation.
Well, I don't think that's borne out. I think the whole thing was alienating.
Yeah.
It changed the way people related to their environment, to time, to work, to the meaning of work,
to the neighbour,
to the responsibility for doing a skilled job and so on.
But if you'll allow me to extend, with so much what we have to do in the information world rather than the machine world, I think we've started to extend the concept of the less alienated, skilled working class person. They may be doing coding, they may be working with AI, but actually we've moved a long way away from the kind of semi-slavery existence of people who were working at the runt end of the mills back then.
But as we're entering that virtual world, people have never felt so lonely. People have never felt so alienated. People have never felt so insulated. And actually, this isn't speculation. You just have to ask them. There's statistical research on people saying the degree to which they feel connected.
I quote a lot of this in The Matter with Things. People have never been so alienated. They've never felt so purposeless, so valueless, so isolated.
And they are in virtual communities.
It doesn't really matter. If you look across our society now, I'm sorry, there just is a really cataclysmic increase in distress.
Yeah.
And some of that distress is expressed as loneliness, and some of it is expressed as anxiety and depression. And largely it's centered on a sense of meaninglessness of life.
Yes.
And that nothing they do seems to matter or mean anything anymore. And I think, well, I have related this to three particular alienations. Alienation from a coherent traditional society in which you live together with people whose values you share, whose lives you share, and who have common ideals and goals. The alienation from the natural world, which is what we stem from however much we virtualize ourselves.
Alienation from the fruit of your labour.
We'll return to. And alienation from the spiritual world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are three very striking features of modern life, and I'm amazed to say that the scientific evidence that these things are fantastically important for human flourishing, for mental health, for physical health, for cognition, never mind for morality and a sense of resilience in life. These things are the crucial elements.
Can I offer one little suggestion? Because those 3 points that you highlight, alienation from neighbour, alienation from nature, and alienation from the spiritual life.
And also alienation, I think, from the product of your work.
Maybe.
It's very important.
Well, maybe, but that's a sort of secondary thing.
I think it is. I
wonder whether it's primary, actually.
Well,
But anyway, let's go. Keep going.
Well, in my own experience, I found a therapy in this regard in hunting with hounds.
Now that I wasn't expecting.
Well,
I have to say. I must say, I love it, but
perhaps you should have.
This is Roger and fox hunting as well.
Roger found it. You immediately find yourself in a traditional community that's completely tied to the land. Yeah. You have a genuine concern and care for the way other people's flourishing is unfolding. Mm-hmm. You immerse yourself in the natural processes of. You literally join a synthetic wolf pack, and you enter the wilderness, and you manage the wildlife alongside your animal collaborator. And in some way, the inner hidden meaning of the landscape, if you like, the spiritual side of the world, is disclosed precisely by your participation in its cycle. And you know, it's very important that hunting has specific seasons outside of which it is forbidden to hunt, right? You are entering into the cycle of the world, and I think it's actually extremely important that if you go into any traditional pub or anywhere in this country, you'll see hunting prints everywhere. It used to be the heart of our culture precisely because it reconciled people to these three forms of connectedness that you're talking about.
I hadn't thought of it in quite that detail as related to those three elements, and I imagine there's a lot in that. It's not that I think badly of hunting as a tradition. In fact, I found Roger's short book on hunting probably the most persuasive thing of his that I've ever read. And I feel it very strongly. I think it's a very important thing. But it just seemed a slightly unusual answer to the question, so what do we do? Go hunting. Yeah,
not everyone can go hunting, obviously.
Why?
Well, why not?
Because the entire everyone outside of a really deep urban culture in England used to be involved in some way, even if that just meant turning up to the meet and having a glass of sherry. Everyone used to be involved in the cycle of the hunt. And I if not hunting, then something. You have to find a therapy.
So here, for example, thinking of our neighbours, Robbie and Ian, who've developed their flock of sheep, they slaughter them themselves on principle, because we talked about this, and a particular mini form of alienation is you get meat from the supermarket, and you don't acknowledge the life of the lamb that we've just eaten. It just happens to be, there in some plastic. Whereas if you've raised the lamb and you personally slaughter it, I think that gets us pretty close to where you're going.
Yeah.
Because you know what's involved, and you've not. I think you do, but I think it's far more in tune with a sort of something I don't disrespect, but a kind of general softness, which is part of our culture these days. Everybody must be exquisitely sensitive to not hurting anything or anyone, and I'm certainly not decrying that. I certainly don't value hurting where not necessary, but I think the thing about hunting is that it's almost mystical, because it brings in something very profound. I remember trying to explain this to a very young person, and he said, "This is just extraordinary. It's completely changed my view of what's going on."
Well, it's also ritualistic.
It's ritualistic.
Hunting always involves the wearing of special vestments.
Special clothes.
Special clothes, of greeting each other in very particular ways, carrying out a whole set of, even it has its own language. You would never talk about a fox's tail, you would talk about its brush. You would never talk about a hound's tail, you would talk about its stern. You would never call it a dog, you would call it a hound. You would never count it in singles, you would count it in couples. And if you like, the degree to which you learn the language of hunting is the degree to which you're being inducted into this community, and you can say, we are a group of people who can communicate, almost like Trappist monks and their sign languages to each other. You have this inner lexicon.
So for me, the antithesis is the industrial abattoir.
absolutely.
And I've been in industrial abattoirs, so I've seen the process.
It's
I've also seen what happens to the people.
absolutely terrifying.
Also seen what happens to the workers there. The
Yes,
turnover of workers
Yes.
in those abattoirs is
Yes.
maximum a couple of months.
And they often become brutalized in the process.
Yeah. So, you know, those are what put the shrink wrap stuff on the shelf in Tesco.
Yeah.
And when we come back to alienation of all the kinds you were describing, Ian, it's primarily a disconnect of imagination. That's the theme that runs through the piece.
Yes, I
So we
think
have
that's
no
true.
imagination or interest in what's happened in those little gaps in the journey of some living being towards our plate, towards our community, towards whatever. So we indulge in those disconnects.
Well,
Hunting, as you're saying, would be, you know, kind of an iconic way of reconnecting.
Yes.
But I think then, for those who might not be able to go out with the hounds, having, you know, that awareness, at the very least, of where stuff comes from,
Yes.
which most people don't want to have.
No. Well, I think the key word is connection, really, that these things are to do with relationships, and that it is relationships that are foundational in existence and make us what we are, and make it possible for human life to feel fulfilled and to flourish. And what we are doing with our bureaucratization, our mechanization, our AI ventures, I'm really doing very well, is to undermine the essential live relatedness. I mean, it's not just a passive relation. Again, I'm talking about something which is reciprocal, reverberative, responsive, and responsible. It is to do with a true living connection. That is what life is about. That is what life is. And that is what love is. Seguimos tibi gracias on estes prohisis universis donis tuis, quae de tua lagitate cepimus, qui vivis et regnas et eis Deus in saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Amen.
Ave Maria Deo Gratias. On this occasion, though, for those who are not Latin speakers, it's really a mark of what a wonder it is in a disconnected world to have such wonderful living connections between friends.
Radiance of moon, splendor of fog, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of the sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me.
So last night, Ian, my friend Dominic, and I had a wonderful meal at Dominic's house. The conversation was extremely rich, enjoyed over this wonderful roast lamb and fine wine. And a theme that kept on emerging is that of what is conservatism? What are conservatives trying to do? Are we concerned simply with daily politics, or is there a wider, deeper civilizational question that conservatives are trying to address? And I hoped that the conversation would go in that direction. I tried to steer it in that way, and that's why I wanted to talk over a meal like that, because I think that that's what conservatism at its best is really about. It's about friendship, it's about bonds between people, loyalties, becoming more human together. I suppose these topics inevitably lead to something like, well, fine, but what do we do about it? And I'm meeting now Ian for one final conversation, really about if all of that is true and his observations are pressing for us now, then how ought we to live, and what should we go away and think about? And that's the final conversation I hope to have with Iain, and I'm looking forward to seeing him again this morning. There are an increasing number of people, I suppose, social commentators who are worried and anxious about our dependence on technology, about the way that we are incrementally moving out of an engagement with reality and into a world almost lived vicariously and through virtual reality. And because people are becoming conscious of this, people are saying, well, maybe unplug from your mobile phone, maybe find ways of rediscovering a humane life. This seems to be very in keeping with at least some of the imperatives that arise out of what you've been saying and what you've been writing.
I would very much endorse that for a host of reasons. And one that people don't talk about so much, but is certainly obvious, is that in order to sustain deep attention to anything, we can't afford to be constantly distracted by minute to minute or second to second news from a phone or something.
Yes,
So that's got to be
Yes.
minimised. But it's something much deeper. It's about what we are and what we're doing here. And people talk about the worry that AI is becoming more like human beings. I don't think it is. It's becoming like a simulacrum of a human being, which is a very, very different thing. Meanwhile, human beings are becoming more machine-like in their thinking, in their responses, and so on. And it's that is particularly worrying. The idea that, we really ought to rethink who we are, what we're doing here, or at least have some concept of what we're doing here. I think this is something that was given to us by an intuitive process that involved culture and religion and spirituality in general, but it has been stripped away from life. And so nowadays I don't think people know what they should be doing, where they're going, or why they should do anything at all.
So it seems to me that, at least in the political and social arena, there for a long time we've said, let's get quote-unquote values out of the public square. Let's talk about things like growth, the economy, property,
Yes.
individual liberty, but in terms of what actually binds us together as a people. And it seems that a return to that is in some way what you're asking for.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm asking for quite a lot, really. But the thing is, I don't think that it's that. I don't want people to be overfaced and think, well, how on earth can we move from where we are now? It's a trick of the light, as it were, that we think we're so very far from it. It's something that can be disclosed within us at almost any moment. As I say, it's not that our brains have really altered, but the way in which we use our brains has altered.
Yes.
And so it's still there.
Yeah.
The faculties are still there. We just need to allow them to express to us the sense of a whole world, a world that has meaning, purpose, direction, and value. And value itself has been reduced to money, hasn't it? When people say,
Sure.
it has value, or there is value to come from it, what they mean is money.
Yeah.
and that's the one thing that is not a suitable value.
Right.
It can be many other things, but it is not a value. And so we've got to somehow recover that sense that values are important, which has been stripped away partly by technology and partly by kind of cod science, popular science, not properly understood science.
Right at the end of the matter with things, and this is a theme that keeps on emerging in our conversations, you talk about a recovery of spirituality, a recovery of religion, and also in The Master and the Emissary, you look very much to the East, and you say that there are practices that are totally normative within Asiatic culture, which perhaps we had analogues of at some point here in the West, but they're certainly not now.
Indeed we did. Yes, no, that's right, and that's hardly an original observation, but the contrast is stark, particularly when you look at things from a point of view of the hemisphere theory, because it's not true what people used to say, that the people in the East are all right hemisphere and people in the West are all left hemisphere, because as you know, part of being right hemisphere is getting a balance anyway. And I think that balance used to be there. What's happening now, I don't know
Right.
in the Far East. But
Because
they could teach us things that we can't afford not to know.
or at least their traditions might. I mean, it seems that in the East at the moment, as you say, there's been an adoption of a lot of the same materialism and a lot of the same hedonism as has
Yes,
sort of
absolutely.
taken over in the West in the last decades.
It's very difficult to resist, because what you're really asking people to do is accept a less comfortable world, but a much richer one. And what they think of is, oh, I won't have my whatever it is. But but that's to have exchanged a toy for a whole world of wonder and beauty, which is the world that we are no longer really in touch with.
But you see some hope, you were saying yesterday, among the young people who are
Very
coming
much
up.
so,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I take it for granted that oldies like me will see many of the things I do, but really exciting is that young people, they've got an intuition that there's something drastically missing.
Right.
And so, you know, it's innate in a human being to realize some of the losses, unless you are so. I think what happens in the West, as you grow through the culture that you and I have grown through, you're somehow anaesthetized or deadened to what it is you've lost.
Yes.
And in many ways, capitalism needs to keep that very quiet while it says, no, but you can buy this and buy that.
Right. Right.
And
And there's this sense that they've suddenly found themselves living in the shadow of some civilization
Yes.
that they don't really, they haven't been inducted into, they don't understand
No.
it, but they're stumbling about in it.
Yes.
And they see fragments of it and say,
Yes.
well, maybe that was part of my inheritance. I want that, I want to reclaim it.
I think that's absolutely right. And whenever people have started, as they have in certain colleges that have sprung up in the desert left by the mainstream educational system, where they have emphasized more what was certainly part of my education, and I'm sure yours, which is to understand the culture of Greece, of Rome, of the Renaissance, of the things that have made us, and to see the beauty and value in that.
Yes.
And if you can find your bearings, then you're no longer a lost soul. And worry is that people will latch on to almost anything in order to give them a sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And sometimes that would be entirely bogus. I think another thing C.S. Lewis said was, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything.
Chesterton.
Oh, is it Chesterton?
That's Chesterton.
Chesterton, right.
Yes.
Very much in the spirit of...
Yes, indeed.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I want to bring up the Renaissance because the Renaissance is for you, it seems, a moment of climax in our civilizational story, and certainly one looking at the material culture of Florence or Venice or Siena or whatever, it's very difficult not to be absolutely amazed. But it's also a time of, it seems to me, it's also the time of people like Francis Bacon. There seems to be this, the first steps of this narrowing of the mind, of trying to see the world exclusively from the perspective of utility, of efficiency. And I wonder whether the rise of a new interest in Neoplatonic thought, of Hermetic thought among people like Ficino and Pico was a response to the first steps of a reductionist
Yes, I
account
think
of the
that's
world.
right. I mean, incidentally, I would put in a word for Francis Bacon,
Go on.
who I think is misunderstood. And,
Okay, fair enough.
and who was, I mean, he said, you know, for nature to be understood, she needs to be obeyed, not commanded.
Right.
But he's also said various other things that can be interpreted in a less favourable way.
Yes.
But in any case, your general point, I think, is right. And
Could that be a path? Could that be a path out of this? I mean, it's very difficult to say to somebody who doesn't accept the scriptural account of salvation history. Well, you know, if you want to recover the enchanted view that your civilization would have given you, start going to church. I mean, it's very difficult for someone who just doesn't believe it to say, okay, well, I'll do that.
Well, I think the problem of belief is, you know, what do we mean by belief? And belief is really an allegiance, not a signing up to a bunch of improbable propositions. And it seems to me that that what the church ought to do is to have places, churches, in the middle of cities where there is no evangelizing going on, but you see people enacting rites, saying holy words, paying respect to ideas which will seem unusual to the functionalist mind, and that actually by observing this, taking part in it and feeling something coming to you, you would find people gravitated to it in an insane surrounding. They would go to this place for the sense of something deep, something peaceful, something good going on.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the two congregational bodies that seem to be growing, particularly among the young, are traditional Catholic communities
Yes.
and
Orthodox.
Eastern Orthodox communities,
Exactly,
which
yeah.
are very much liturgy based, rather than going out and saying, here are a set of propositions and if you sign up to them you'll be saved. Instead of doing that, it's the ongoing encounter with God through a liturgical experience
Yes.
that seems to be really capturing the imaginations of young people in particular.
Yes.
My wife and I and our children, we go to a traditional Catholic parish, and it's absolutely full of young families,
It's lovely.
young people, and I think a lot of it is looking around at one great madhouse and being told that this is normality and everything you could ever want, and saying, well, I don't
Don't buy
believe
that.
it.
No. Well, so what do you make of the argument that that congregations are dwindling everywhere, and that in 30, 40, 50 years the church will cease to exist?
Well, I think certain congregations are dwindling, and the great the great irony is that, you know, particularly this is a characteristic of the Church of England, but it's also a characteristic of other denominational groups. That among many of the leaders, there's an assumption is that if they're more modern,
No, absolutely.
if they're more up to date, if they're more,
Yes.
if they're cooler,
Yes, yes.
then the young people are just going to come flooding in.
Yes.
But actually, as I say, the only congregations that are really growing among the youth
Yes.
are those who are saying, well, actually, no, let's live in a way that's a response to modernity rather
Yes.
than a concession to modernity.
I completely agree with you, and I thought of that right away in my teens when in the Anglican Church they were starting changing the liturgy and so on.
Right.
And thinking that this is, it's like so many things, that if you dumb things down in a certain way and make them more accessible, you actually take away something very important in the process. And it never works. It's almost, it's rather like revolutions often happening at the very moment when what they were supposed to achieve has been achieved. And the revolution then goes on just to alienate people.
Right.
And it seems a bit like that it's rather like what happens to the sort of culturally interesting programs that used to exist on the BBC,
Yeah.
the tone of them has become very chatty and simple because,
Yes.
of course, the liberal elite patronise the ordinary person to the most appalling degree. I think they won't get it and won't understand it. And as a result, they alienate their own constituency. So I used to avidly listen to Radio 3. I don't bother anymore.
I used to work as somebody who trained catechists and
Yes.
for a Catholic diocese. And what's very interesting is you found that the more intense this commitment was to a sort of modern, groovy
Yes.
style religion, also the more bureaucratic it was.
Yes.
The more draconian it was. There was always this sense of progress, but not innovation, not spontaneity.
Yes,
Not, you know,
yes.
and I wonder whether there is something seriously left brain going on here as church communities, or some at least, go in that direction.
Yes, well, it's a simple misunderstanding. You think that the reason people are not going to church is because they miss something that they find in their everyday life. They want church to be more like that.
Yeah.
Actually, they want the church to offer something less like that.
Yes.
And so it's the opposite move to be making.
Yes. So not everyone can come to the Isle of Skye, or at least I'm not sure that's what you would like.
Almost everybody seems to come.
So, but there is this great appetite for living differently now.
Yes.
Living, the number of friends I have who have started doing little things like keeping their own chickens and a vegetable patch, and trying to find some way of reconciling themselves to the concreteness of reality and immersing themselves in the cycles of the year and so on. There's, not because it's cost effective or anything, but you know, it's like this is done out of a necessity, an internal necessity.
Yes, and I think it's a very important and telling response, and I think that potentially it could be a solution. I'm a great supporter of an organisation called Local Futures, which is about the deglobalisation of our relationships with the community, of the growing of the food for that community and so forth. So to the degree that it is possible, and it will become more possible the more we try and the more we think about it, I think this is a very important move, yes. And we may find ourselves in a situation before long where not only is it a ridiculous extravagance to have your vegetables flown in from Peru, but actually we can't get them anymore.
Sure.
Various things I think will happen, and there will be shortages, and there will be breakdowns of the extraordinary cumbersome machinery, and not to mention just the planes that bring all this. And we may find ourselves in need of skills that we've lost.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of Ukraine. I mean, it's no longer unthinkable that situations of war or insurrection or sheer necessity of migrations of desperate populations will cause upheavals to our way of life. And if we've de-skilled ourselves, no longer understand where anything comes from, are totally dependent on a machine which is breaking down, we can't survive. And I often think of Ian Foster's short story, The Machine. You know, it's people living in this machine. They don't really know anything outside of the machine. And then the machine stops. It's called The Machine Stops, that's what it's called.
It's funny, this mention of withdrawing from a globalized account of human flourishing and coming back to a concrete embodied account. Edmund Burke argued that as the polity becomes more centralized in its arrangement, persons become eclipsed, persons disappear.
Yes,
The way that he put it is, as things become centralized and delocalized, hearts become cold, is the way that he put it.
Absolutely, one sees that as a relentless progress in modernity. And at the same time, of course, it's accompanied by a rhetoric, as these things always are, about, you as an individual. And when there's a slogan of this kind, I always think, so what's being hidden here? And it was like when a supermarket, which I will not name, adopted a slogan, name of supermarket, taste the difference, taste the good. And I think somebody had said the trouble with our supermarket food is it's relatively tasteless compared with the stuff that people used to grow locally. And so you adopt the slogan, and that's the way it works on your point about Burke. I'm often criticised for being rather harsh on Plato.
Right.
But again, since my teens, I thought there's something wrong with the direction of this, which is all about a perfection that exists only in an abstract way,
Yes.
in another realm from the one that we're in. And I've always felt that took things in the wrong direction. I know Plato is a very complex person. Almost everything you say about him, you can find reasons for arguing the opposite way.
Indeed. Yeah.
But there is that element that has, at any rate, if we don't want to blame Plato for it, blame his
Interpreters.
His interpreters, yes.
And again, it seems to me that a lot of this was remedied by Plotinus and Proclus and Porphyry,
Yes.
who with their theory of emanation and participation, the notion that yes, there is this utter transcendence of God, which in a certain sense you want to spiritually ascend to, but at the same time, the whole of your experience of creation is participating in his being and is itself an emanation of his inner life. And so the encounter must take place somehow in the midst of that.
Yes. Yes.
And this brings us back to the Renaissance, the great hunger for these texts and a Neoplatonic recovery.
Yes, yes, indeed. And it also brings us back to the conversation we had another day on the nature of the Trinity and its relation to panentheism, the idea that God is in everything and everything is in God. And that idea is present, obviously, at the centre of Christianity. It antedates Christianity as well. I'm sure you know that. And it's also found in Rumi, and so it's...
And the Vedic texts.
And the Vedic text. So this idea of a sanctified creation, which is itself an expression of the God that is also capable of being transcendent, but is also immanent.
Well, I wonder whether, I mean, there's a long-standing ascetic practice of meditating on the mystery of the Trinity itself.
Right.
And it does seem to me that if you want to, if you like, free the right brain, having to sit and come to peace with an infinite reality that is also finite in as much as it can be conceived of in parts, but isn't in parts, is always one, that one of the members of the Trinity isn't more God than the other, that they're consubstantial but always distinct, that the relations in the Trinity are substantial relations rather than accidental relations, that you're having to hold so many things in harmony that are, if you like, quite clearly contradictions, but you have to overcome the contradiction to discover the paradoxical reality that is always there's always more to meditate on. I mean, that's almost the definition of a mystery, that it's not something that the intellect dismisses, but the intellect can sit with forever, so to speak.
Yes, aware of something there that cannot be made explicit, but there is enough power in its implicit meaning to keep one focused on it and engaged with it, encountering it, and trying to bring whatever it is gradually more and more to life.
Yes.
The Trinity is a puzzling thing for many people, but there are two lovely expressions of it. One came to me from a simple Franciscan monk. It's probably a very common one, but it's the only time I've heard it. What is a book? Is it the conception in the mind of the person who wrote it? Is it this volume on the table, or is it what happens when someone takes it away and reads it? And that seemed to me to help quite a lot.
Right.
And then I came across this lovely thing in Rumi, that it is a never-flowing fountain. It is the water that flows forth from the fountain, and it is what is gathered in the cup and drunk. Like those different ways of helping one into an imagination of what is being
Yeah.
spoken of.
Yeah. And I suppose these islands at one point were absolutely covered in Irish monks and so on who were meditating on exactly these things as the entire course of their lives.
But one of the things that fascinates me is that they weren't satisfied with going up to the north of Scotland, where there was pretty much nothing going on, in order to seek their peace. But they would then cross the sea, in dangerous sea, in coracles, with precious tomes that could be lost, in order to be on an even more remote island. And I'm thinking, you know, this is the days before EasyJet. If you got a few miles out of Londinium, you could probably have as much peace as you wanted.
People talk about when they go to Lindisfarne, for example, that it seems that the landscape itself is sacral. The very earth feels holy, that the prayers and the petitions of hundreds, perhaps thousands of monks, the landscape itself is now pregnant with that longing for God. Does the landscape here have a similar sense for you?
Yes, I don't know quite how to articulate it, but I think particularly when one gets off onto the mountains, onto the hills, onto the cliffs, which are often very, very strange and sort of wild and awe-inspiring, there's some sense of another world that's there, almost immediately there. And visitors say, you know, the same thing, that they feel that it's one of those thin places where the world beyond shows through the world that we see before us.